بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين. Barakallahu feekum. Inshallah, it's really nice to be here and to meet all of you and see all of you. I shared with some sisters earlier that I had spent some of the early years of my life in New Jersey, northern Jersey, but haven't had the chance to come back. So it's very much a pleasure to be here. My thanks to your community for hosting us, and it's really an honor to share some words with you, inshallah. I was asked or tasked to speak on the topic of spirituality within our families. And from the audience that I see here today, I see that there are many families, many mothers with young children, and also women who are in the process, and young women as well, and I'm sure the same on the men's side. So it sounds like it's a very relevant discussion, inshallah ta'ala. It's a two-part discussion, so I'll begin with some of the foundational parts of this talk, and Sheikh Rami will take on from there, and I'll speak more on the theoretical, he'll speak more on the practical, although I will try to implement some of the practical in our talk today too. Anytime we speak about spirituality within the family or the purpose really of having family in Islam, we have to first look at the Quran and see what it is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intended for us. If relationships within families are going to go smoothly according to how Islam intended them to be, then we have to look at our original sources, our primary sources, which of course we begin with the Quran and the Hadith. So help me, share with me what you think in terms of the sisters here in the audience. Where are some of the main ayat that speak about the purpose of us as human beings on earth in the first place? What is our purpose here? What ayat comes to mind? Yes. Barakallahu fiki. Exactly. Thank you. So the sister mentioned the ayah, and I'll translate, that Allah says that He has only created the humans, right, one jinn, except the only reason is to worship Him. So that's what I call the million-dollar questions that non-Muslims are always trying to figure out. What's the purpose of life on earth? What's our purpose as humans? You have the ayah immediately in the Quran answering it. It's clear. You are here for the purpose of worship. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not intend that, and the scholars who came and explained the ayat, right, the Tafsir, did not limit that worship just to your 5 daily prayers, or just to the month of Ramadan, or just to the Hajj that inshallah you perform or have performed, or the zakat if it's intended for you to give. In fact, everything that a Muslim does is what? Or should be what? Worshipping Him, Jalla Jalaluhu, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying to us that at the central focus of our point, the point of us being here on earth, is to worship Him in everything you do, in everywhere you go, in everything you say, in any part and stage of your life. And women have multiple stages of life, right? The before marriage, the before kids, being a daughter primarily, a sister primarily, and then later, should marriage come into the picture, a wife, and should children come into the picture, a mother, and perhaps later a grandmother, and later, right, as children get older, move out from the home, and the grandchildren perhaps fill some of that void, and perhaps not. But the central focus always is that you are abida, and for the men, abid lillahi ta'ala, always, regardless of what else is happening around you. That you're not defined by the very people around you, rather you're defined by your purpose in life, which is worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in whatever stage that is. Does that make sense? Alright, so that's one of the foundational principles where we begin this conversation. What else comes to mind? What does Allah say about the purpose of having children? What are they meant to do for us? I can't quite hear. Ziyat al-hayat al-dunya. What else? Good, but what else? What is the purpose of having and procreating, having another generation? So the sister refers to a hadith which we'll come to later about takabbur. Alright? What else?
Anything else? What's that?
What about the word khalifa? Does this ring a bell for anybody?
From the brother's side, they said to continue the legacy.
Aha, alright. So, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in His glorious book, I will place a Khalifa on earth, who is He referring to? To the believers. He's speaking to us, as us, the believers, right? And for this reason, we then understand that Islamic nurturing or spirituality has everything to comes back to this point of qiyam, right? Of the purpose Allah put us on earth to worship Him, as we understand now, and also the next generation to bring up. What is the translation of Khalifa? The sister says successor. Right? Yes, very good. Yes, that's a different translation. Perfect. So here, we're talking about then the people that are going to be able to cultivate this worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So then we understand now our purpose and the purpose of the other people within our family and what the primary goal is according to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the point where we begin the discussion. Not the point of discussion of, okay, now I'm married, I have these kids, and this is my husband, or vice versa, this is my wife, and now how do I deal with it? This is too late in the conversation. The conversation starts all the way over here, right? You're over here, right? We need to start from the very beginning of the conversation of what was the point in the first place that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intended. Then, as we continue talking about nurturing your tarbiyah in Islam, then we start to understand that this is something you have to be preoccupied with from the very beginning. It should shape and color everything that you do and all the choices that you make in your life. The choices that then are like a domino effect that affect everything else. One after another, one after another, one after another. Right? And if there is a gap somewhere, then you're going to feel that gap even within your home, of the lack of balance and the difficulty in spirituality in your home. So the sister mentioned a hadith, where the Prophet ﷺ is talking about having children. And what was that hadith, sister? What did the Prophet ﷺ say? Yes. Right, exactly. So the Prophet, I'll translate here the hadith, thank you for sharing it. Where the Prophet ﷺ says, get married and have many children. For I will boast about you to other nations. So on one hand, what is your hearing? Have more and more children, and mashallah, our Muslim community is endowed with children. That's a lot of kula. We tend to have a lot, and we usually go back to this hadith and point to it and say, but the Prophet said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? Takatharu, right? Tanakahu, takatharu, inni mudahim bil right? I'm going to boast about you on the day of judgment. True? But you see, this hadith is also balanced out by another hadith. This hadith, the first one that we just mentioned, is one about quantity. There is another discussion, another hadith, that talks about a different concept, and the two have to be balanced. This is a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ is sitting with the Sahaba, and he foretells about the end of time. And he says to his companions, and says, how worried he is about the Muslims who are going to be later, coming later, right? And so the companions ask the weakness of their faith. So the companions ask him what? Is it for the fact that they are going to be little in number? Because when Islam started, they were little in number. So maybe that's why Islam was weak, they were thinking. Will it then become little in number again? And what does the Prophet ﷺ say? He says no. Very good. Exactly, sister. MashaAllah. He says they will be many. There will be so many. What does he compare? What's the simile he gives? They will be like what? Yes, what's that? Very good. They will be like the foam on the crest of the wave. You know, on the beach where you see the foam? I don't know how far the water is from here, MashaAllah. But the foam, right? We see this because on California, we're right on the Pacific Ocean there. So as you see the water quite a bit, and if you see the foams, right, the foam coming through on the crest, right, all this white bubbly thing. Does it have any substance to it? Is it worth anything? Nothing. It comes and it recedes again, and nothing. It's done nothing. It's given nothing, right? And it disappears. So the Prophet ﷺ says it's not because there's not going to be enough Muslims in the future. Rather, there's going to be so many but they will be as weak as this foam on the crest of the ocean. Right? So from this, the scholars and the teachers tell us the importance of quality. There is a discussion of quantity, but also balanced with the discussion of quality. Right? That investing in each and every one of the children that we have to make sure that they're going to be khulafa, right, as intended, and worshippers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as intended by Allah Jalla Jalaluhu. So here we continue then and say, the scholars, now they have this, we talked about the Quran, we talked about the Hadith literature, and now the scholars are going to then tell us about spirituality within our homes. So the first thing they start with and say, look, when you talk about the topic of spirituality, it is incredibly important that you take this discussion from the Muslim scholars. You can take many things from other points of view, from other forms of scholarship. But when it comes to spirituality, you must take this from Islamic scholarship only. And let me explain why. You see, the Muslim scholars of old understood our noble predecessors, understood something that only now in modern society are people finally starting to understand. The concept of the holistic understanding of a child or of a person. Right? Only now are psychologists and cognitive scientists and behavioral scientists finally understanding that all of this relates in how we raise a child. True? However, if you look at the scholars, our noble predecessors, yesterday when I was at NYU, I spent a good deal of time talking about the first hospitals in Islam. And did you know that the first mental health hospitals in the world happened where and when? Where and when?
Anybody from here?
First psychiatric
Any guesses?
mental health hospitals.
Any guesses from your brother's side? What's that?
Huh?
Oh.
Allah Akbar. Somebody got knows our history. And when in history? When?
You can't guess.
What stage of history are we talking about? I'll help you out. The 8th century. We're talking very early, right? Not too long after the advent of Islam. And yesterday, and I won't belabor this since today's a different discussion, but the important that you understand this is when you see what the scholars of old have come up with. Then when they looked at the ill person and they wanted to treat the person, they did not just send them the doctor. Rather, today, the hospital where I trained at Stanford, they pride themselves, and as do many modern hospitals, pride themselves on something called the interdisciplinary team. Right? The interdisciplinary team. Who's what? Who's in this team? The people that care for you if you are admitted to the hospital. Who are they? The doctor, a psychologist, a social worker, good, a nurse. And if you need medications, if there's a pharmacist involved, even if they're in the background, you don't see them, if they're involved, yes. So you see all these different people make up what today they call the interdisciplinary team. Would you be surprised if I told you that Islamic hospitals, this was the model that they had, the interdisciplinary team, in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries and onwards, when only modern medicine now has come up with this concept and implemented it and prided itself on it. And if you look at where the hospitals were set up, I was mentioning about Al-Razi yesterday and said that he was tasked with finding out the best place to put the hospital, that he would take raw meat and put it in different parts of the land to see where the moths and bugs would come first. And the ones where the moths did not come for some time, he knew the air quality was cleaner in that area, so they would build the hospitals there. Way forward thinking. Right? And the greenery and the types of treatment that was very holistic. And the person that we missed, by the way, on the team was spiritual. Right? So they integrate and understand the interlocking with the meshing concepts of what it means to be a holistic human being. These were our scholars. This is your and our Islamic heritage, right? That we don't know much about anymore. We put all our faith into modern medicine or all our faith into Western concepts and say, aha, they got it. When in reality, we figured it out millennium before them. Do you understand? MashaAllah. Nevertheless, there are concepts and theories that you might read a book on child raising, or you may read a book on human development, or you may read a book on psychology and say, oh, that makes a lot of sense. A lot of all these New Age books and Dr. So-and-so and whoever so-and-so and this book was recommended by Oprah and whatever. Right? You may read these books and say, hey, this makes a lot of sense. What we're saying here is, up to a certain point, physical knowledge, cognitive knowledge, even emotional knowledge, you can take from other sources. When it comes to spirituality, it can only be from Islamic sources. Because non-Muslim spirituality and understanding of God and spirituality is different than our understanding, and it does not mesh. Also, there is a problem of maybe taking, and let me give you a historical example. Who knows the story of Samarkand? What is Samarkand? Where is Samarkand? Good. Fantastic. And what is the story of Samarkand in Islamic history books? Okay. Tell me the story then. What is your understanding of when Islam spread? Right? The spread of Islam. And the Muslim armies and the Muslims in general spread into other countries. They used to give the people of those countries who were not yet Muslim 3 choices. 3 choices. What were they? Either they accept Islam and Islam becomes a Muslim land, or they pay the jizya, sister mashallah, or they don't accept they accept the rule of, so basically they accept the rule of Islam and they become Muslims, let's say, or they don't, but they're going to retain their own religion, but they will be ruled by the Muslims and they pay the jizya, or what?
The big J.
What's the third one?
Big J.
What if they don't want the Muslims there? What will they do?
What's that?
Mm-hmm. Fight, yes.
Jihad.
This is jihad. Brothers are saying jihad. Jihad. However, even that had rules to it. So they have to give the people that are living in those lands some time to prepare if they're going to go to war. Yes? And how much time would they give them? Did they just immediately fight them? No. How much time did they give them? This is a good history lesson here. I don't know. No. Just a matter of days. How many days? No? 3
days, yeah.
So they give them 3 days to prepare themselves. And so in the history books, this was, they'd say such and such country came into Islam, such and such country decided to have war. Okay, well Samarkand, the people of Samarkand did not accept that they would become ruled by the Muslim or the jizya. They said, we're going to go to war. The history books, the Muslim history books, are written as such, and they actually consider the story of Samarkand one of their prized discussions of history and Muslim justice. Okay? Because the people of Samarkand, imagine, 75 years later. How long has the longest person that's been in this community lived here? How long have you lived here? 30 years. So what's this 30 years? Anybody lived here longer than 30 years?
Anybody longer than 30?
No? We have any 40, 50, 60 years? Yeah? Not quite. So the Muslim community in Europe is still relatively young. Your community here is still relatively young. Some pockets, you find people who have lived in a certain place longer. Imagine 75 years. What does that mean? It means your children have grown up, and your grandchildren have grown up, and your great-grandchildren have grown up in those lands. And there's been an assimilation of some sorts, people intermarrying in some sorts, and on and onwards. You become part of that country, part and parcel of that country. Imagine 75 years later, the people of Samarkand go to the Khalifa at the time, who is Harun al-Rashid, and they complain to him and say, when the Muslim army came and gave us our 3 choices, and we chose jihad, they they came to fight us after 2.5 days. They didn't give us the full 3 days. 2.5 days. So what did Harun al-Rashid rule? What would you think his rule was? After 75 years of Muslims living there and being in charge.
Anybody have a guess?
Yeah?
What's that? One of the brothers says, take all the army out.
Exactly. Can you imagine? Can you imagine that somebody comes to you now after you've been established here, you bought your homes here, you raised your families here, and your children, and your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, and they say, now you must go. The Khalifa, your Khalifa says you must leave.
It's a grandfather clause, right?
Imagine. Right? And that's what they did. And the Muslims started to pack up and they were starting to leave. And the people of Samarkand are watching this happening and going, what's going on? Are they really going to listen to the Khalifa and get up and leave? They have to. They're bound by it. So as they're packing and getting up and ready to leave, the people of Samarkand said, no, don't go. Don't go. Right? We actually want you to stay. We actually have prospered under your rule. And it said that on that day, having seen the justice of the Khalifa and the justice of the Muslims, 75 years later, after all that time, because they missed a half day that the rulers at the time should have paid better attention to and didn't, that the justice of the Muslims, they saw that so many people of Samarkand came into Islam and converted. SubhanAllah. So in our history books, the Muslim history books, we can consider that a prized story of history of Muslim justice. Now, same story, but you look at it from the Western or the non-Muslim perspective. How is it written? The Muslims entered Samarkand and conquered them. And then the story about 75 years later, the ruler told them to leave because it wasn't the right thing. They didn't go about the right, proper ways. And the Muslims got up and started to pack, and they duped the poor people of Samarkand and tricked them into staying there longer. As a story of Muslim injustice. SubhanAllah. And this, I recommend you look it up in the history books. This is actually how it's written. This explains to you the difference of understanding what we call the issue of tawfiq, of verifying the sources, of understanding the sources of knowledge of where they come from. People often joke that the word history is his story. It is the story of the conqueror, right? The one who has the upper hand. And today Muslims, by and large, do not have the upper hand. So things are written about us that is not coming from us, but rather from outside about us. Do you see what I'm saying? It is important that when you look at sources and knowledge, that you don't get so excited about some new theory or some new concept or some new author, and not make sure and do this issue of tawfiq, verifying that it fits with Islam and it actually goes hand in hand with what our beliefs are. And I deal with this all the time in my own field. I'm a psychiatrist, and in the field of psychology, as you know, there's all kinds of trash that does not apply to Muslims. But there's a lot of fantastic concepts and important concepts, and so much of what I'm publishing today actually is showing that a lot of these same concepts our scholars have already spoken about, subhanAllah. Right? In mainstream medical journals, these things are being published for the issues of citation, so that scholars that come after can't just ignore a Muslim contribution, even to a field that is considered to be not a lot of, people feel that psychology especially is kind of separate from Islam. But my theory is actually, it's part and parcel because it is the hadith and nafs and understanding of your actual nafs and how to deal with it. And our scholars have perfected this quite a bit. We're just not knowledgeable of what they've taught us. But back to our discussion here of the issue of tawfiq, because the topic today was on spirituality and spirituality within the family. And you can go and get any texts and any books out there, all these kind of self-help and new age kind of books that talk about having a peaceful home and having a happy home and such, right? But the reality is, you can take certain concepts from them, but once you reach spirituality, you must cut and actually only turn to the Islamic sources of what our teachers and scholars have said about this topic. Otherwise, you'll end up in an issue like that some point, right? Well, you'll be confused by some of the topics that are there that are not applicable to the Muslim. So I wanted to make sure that that was understood clearly. Now, let's shift our attention to another hadith, where the Prophet ﷺ is speaking about children. And he brings up a very important word that we have to spend some time with if we're going to do this topic justice. It's a hadith you all know, where the Prophet ﷺ says that every child is born on me, what? The fitra. Right? And so the scholars have then and then the hadith goes on, right? What does the hadith actually say before we go on? What does the rest of the hadith say? And then what? Perfect. And I'll translate what you said there, that every child is born in fitra until he can speak, and then his parents turn him into a Jew, a Christian, or a Zoroastrian. This topic of speak is really important. We'll get to it hopefully later. but also the topic of fitra, that every human being is born on a fitra. And what does fitra mean? What does it mean? Someone said nature.
What's
What
that?
else? Sister says the love of God. Inshallah.
One of the brothers said fitra is Islam.
Islam. Okay. Mashallah.
Anybody else?
So it's one of those very difficult words. In fact, it's really funny when you look up this word in even Arabic dictionaries, like there are famous ones, like Lisan al-Arab, for example, and it says the word fitra, it goes al-fitra, and then you're supposed to find the definition. It says al-fitra, yani al-fitra. Because they considered it to be so kind of like it's a word that we should all just understood. It's not worth mashallah defining. Anyhow, mashallah. Probably one of the best translations that I've heard for fitra is a natural inclination. Like a natural inclination into what? To whom? To the divine, yes, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's very important, and it stems from the scholars say the time before we were even born. And what am I referring to? Before humans were born, before
The pledge.
Good, yes, the pledge, perfect. And what did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ask us, and what did we respond? Yes, very good. Yes, exactly. He called it's almost like a memory that is implanted from the time before we were on earth, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks us souls. Yes, alastu. Very good. Exactly. Basically what the sister said, am I your Lord? And what do we as humans respond? Bala. Yes, we are. So there is an understanding that this is already a natural inclination that every human being is born with. But later, they are potentially moved away from this thought. And our sisters and brothers who convert to Islam, many times they prefer to be called a revert rather than a convert, because they say, I was already born on this fitrah. I was just moved away and then came back. Wallahu a'lam, subhanAllah, what the best terminology there is, but absolutely this idea of fitrah, almost like this memory of Allah calling to His progeny to witness that He is our Lord. So here we are with this understanding of the spiritual state, or the spiritual point that the human being begins from. And in terms of spiritual states, the topic, people always ask about the topic of the soul, or the ruh, right? And what is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying in the Quran about this? What does Allah say?
About the ruh. الروح من أمر ربي.
Exactly. So he says, they ask you about the soul or the spirit, say it is from my Lord. Right? The knowledge of it is from Allah. Meaning that even though as human beings we don't have all of the knowledge, Allah hasn't revealed to us all of the secret about this topic. However, what we do understand is basically the foundation, so the sound fitrah is essentially the foundation from which the spiritual sight or state is going to grow. So here we now see the beginnings of the foundation of this topic, where the job then of us with each other in a home and working together, right, comes back to the topic of tarbiyah. And what does tarbiyah mean? Someone said discipline.
What's that?
No? Break down the Arabic for me.
Upbringing is an answer from the brother's side.
Good. That's another good translation. Break down the Arabic root of this word.
Does anybody know the Arabic root?
Rab. Very good. Mm-hmm. So tarbiyah, when you break down to the very root, you end up with the word Rab. And what does Rab mean? Look, your Lord, exactly. And when you say somebody is Rabbani, what do you refer to that as? Good. Yes. And when you say Murabbi, what does that mean? Now? An educator, okay, mashallah. Also, we may use the word nurturer. Somebody who nurtures the Murabbi is the one who grows the love or the understanding of the Rabb, of Allah in a person's heart. Right? The Murabbi. And in Islamic history, the role of the Murabbi was much more defined and very clear. We have essentially lost the concept of the Murabbi. We may, in some respects, for some people, still maintain the relationship with a teacher, a sheikh, in some instances a sheikha. But the murabbi category seems to by and large be gone, which is unfortunate. Because when we talk about spiritual upbringing of families and of children, you need the murabbi figure. But who is that? It's not quite the mother. The mother and the father do tarbiyah. They are asked by Allah and requested by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to do tarbiyah, spiritual upbringing of their children, absolutely. But they are not the murabbi. You need a separate person who's going to do what? Who's going to emphasize the same tarbiyah, the same rules and regulations and concepts that the parents are doing, and re-emphasizes them separate from the parents. Helps the parent to instill this further into the child's heart. Here we might have the word something like a mentor of some sort, right? The murabbi, the nurturer. And really their goal is to keep the fitrah as pure as possible as the child grows, right? And really the desire then to have an understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the reason why our youth speak about losing this is maybe from when they were younger, they were never felt connected in the first place. You see, they're born on the fitrah, but unless you continue to nurture the spirituality, it will get lost along the way. And this whole, I should tell you, I should take a pause here and say, this topic that I'm speaking on right now is usually a very long course that I do over a series of months. Weekly classes over a series, it's a long discussion. In fact, it goes through the stages of a child's development all the way from birth, actually pre-birth, pre-conception, all the way to adulthood, and broken down into stages and milestones. And this is actually my teacher's work, so it's actually her work that I'm teaching from. But here, she goes through the physical behavioral milestones, cognitive milestones, and then what's often missed is the emotional milestones of children at each stage, subhanAllah. And what's definitely not discussed are the spiritual milestones of children in different stages. And maybe this we'll have to almost like a teaser, where we'll kind of share this with you, and maybe we'll come back in the future. Maybe you will invite us back to do the full course one day, inshallah, going through Ustadha. But it's a beautiful, beautiful discussion of really understanding how to implement spirituality in the home. And this, in her discussion in relation to children. But really, you cannot even begin to talk about children until you talk about who? Huh? Yes, the parents. And you can't even begin to talk about mom and dad, the parents, until you talk about their relationship as parents, until you talk about their relationship as what? As husband and wife. And you can't speak about their relationship as husband and wife until you first talk about who they were before they were even married. You see, this topic of spirituality in the home is not about the right now. It actually starts from literally preconception, literally from who you chose as a spouse. Because people then get married, have children, and then sort of have this realization of, oh my goodness, I have no idea how to actually implement spirituality in the home. When in reality, the discussions, and this is why I'm so happy there's some young women in the audience who are sort of up and coming, hopefully yet to be married, to really think about these topics before this actually happens. Do you see what I'm saying? SubhanAllah. So here, let's also say that, and just kind of being mindful of time, I'll have to pick some certain things. But you really cannot understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the spiritual connection between you and Him, Jalla Jalaluhu, and experience that faith and Iman without having certain aspects in place. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us our intellect, right, and our senses to experience things. He's given us the heart, right, to have this desire and connection with Him. And we said the topic of fitrah, where the heart is already, if it's in a pure state, already inclined to the divine. Right, in that initial relationship with God and Him. Also, you have to have ibadah, worship, and mu'amalah, right, which comes from a refined nafs. So here, now, we start to talk about the spiritual side. And so really quickly, I'm going to go through kind of a quick synopsis of what this looks like before Sheikh Rami speaks in more detail. If we talk about children, like we said, you can't talk about them even from conception. People say, let's start from like age 0, they were just born. No, you can't even start from pregnancy. You can't even start from conception, or even the marriage of the parents. but all the way from choosing this place. That's where the conversation actually has to start. Because a proper understanding of life begins with the parents' proper Islamic understanding. Because the child is the fruit of that marriage, should Allah give them, bless them with children, right? And it's not the only reason why a person gets married, because marriage is also for protection, to have a partner to help them gain benefit in this life and the hereafter. And if He blesses them with children, then also to have children and kind of continue that khilafah on earth. What's important here to know is that in order to produce these righteous people that will benefit society, there is no room in the hearts to seek out marriage other than these reasons. Right? Protection, companionship, and if you're blessed with children, to continue on the path of children. When you look at non-Muslim marriages, if I were to say these concepts in a non-Muslim setting, they would think I was crazy. No, really. There are some who fall into the same category just as me, and they're typically people of faith, right? God-centered people. But for many, that's not the purpose of marriage. Often it has a lot to do with money or not. It has a lot to do with nasab, which is what, lineage, right? Or has a lot to do with just companionship and traveling and coming and going and whatnot, and status in society and the rest. Which unfortunately, a lot of our Islamic marriages have succumbed to such things as well. Where in reality it should be much loftier goals of why people even go into a union together. Here we also say that having this selfish idea, and I have met and honestly I've counseled woman after woman in my office, unfortunately, where they have feel that children came as a burden to them. And that could be for many reasons. Maybe they were not quite psychologically prepped and prepared for motherhood. Nobody sat them down and actually explained any of this to them, right? And then they found themselves with these crying young children and who are whining and crying and they don't know what on earth to do with them or how to raise them properly. There was no instruction in place. And then they sort of go into this depressed state of, I don't even know if I'm doing this right, I don't even know if I want them. And and then other people say, A'udhu billah, don't say such a thing, haram, right? But that's not going to help her any. Right? What would have helped and what does help is actually talking through and prepping people before they hit the stage, right? And here then we also say that there has to be an understanding of why this marriage and why these children in the first place, if we're going to talk about nurturing and really growing spirituality in the hearts of the people in our family. And in order to have an optimal Islamic society, you really have to have understood and read and studied Islam and its history, what the point is of all of this. And also to know that when the couple marries each other, that there may very well be one who is weaker spiritually than the other. And this is a very common scenario in our families. It's rare, let's say, that the two aren't exactly the same wavelength. If I were to poll you, survey all of you here, which I won't, and ask you how many of you feel like you're at exactly the same spiritual level as your husband, or vice versa, I would probably not get more than 1 or 2 hands, if that. Because it is not the case you don't marry your twin, right? You're marrying somebody completely separate, subhanAllah. So that means that there's always going to be a natural weakness or a natural struggle to fix this difference, bridge the gap between the two. Right? But to do so with gentleness and with love and with understanding, before the children come into the picture is essential. Think about the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that had He created us, that as soon as we get married, that a woman immediately give birth, like the next week, to a child. He could have done whatever he wished. But even if that couple was going to be blessed with a child immediately in the beginning of their marriage, how long does it take for the child to come? At least 9 months, unless they're premature perhaps, but there's at least a number of months in between. What is the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in doing? Exactly. To give us, as women, now I'm speaking to the women here, to give us as women the chance to go from the stage of pre-marriage to the stage of wifehood and get that down and the interaction with the spouse done correctly and the spirituality that needs to happen between the two of them correctly before bringing a third party into the picture with that child. before she takes on another role called mother. Do you see what I'm saying? There is a wisdom, a hikmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in how He had this. Because how do you wish it didn't have to be 9 months? We know that there's some tafsir on the birth of Sayyidina Isa, that his mother Mary, Maryam, alayhi salam, that her birth was not actually a full 9 months. So had He wished, He could have, like this, decided that we have our babies. But there is a wisdom and a hikmah for the time to allow us to adjust. And this is a very important point that I think sometimes in our communities we're rush, from this stage to the next stage, yalla marriage, yalla kids, yalla. There isn't a time of adjusting and really understanding what the purpose of that point in our life is, or that stage in our life is. So really here we have to know and understand what this purpose, and because so many of the problems encountered later in marriage start from the very beginning of marriage, but they're never addressed. The Khalil Center that Brother Kamran was speaking of, one of the many things that they offer for marriage therapy. But by the time you come in for marriage therapy, it's been too late. You should have started. For some time, people come in and they're literally telling us, you're our last resort before divorce. And we're saying, where were you 10 years ago? Do you know what I mean? And even more importantly, the Khalil Center offers something very beautiful, which is called the pre-marriage counseling. 4 sessions where the two are in the room with a trained therapist who's able to then figure out the kinks between them in communication, because almost 80% of marriage is communication between the two. I can't tell you how many times I usually work with a lot of women, but eventually, after some period of time that I work with the woman, I'll ask her to bring her husband in, not for a marriage therapy per se, but for helping the counseling process. And I ask them and I observe them speaking to each other and their way of interacting. And often I'll get complaints like, I don't know, when I first married him or when I first married her, she was so different, I don't know what happened. Or he was so different and look how much he's changed. Always this complaint. But in reality, you know what it is? Almost always, it's not so much, sometimes there is a real change, sometimes. May Allah protect us from such things. In the bad, I mean, the change to the worse. Inshallah, change to the better is what we want. But for often, it's not that there was this huge change that happened. In fact, what happened was there was already a major difference or major issues between them, but one or the two of them stayed silent and just let it go and let it go and let it go silently until the gap widened and widened and widened and widened between them, and then finally one of them hit the roof and said, I can't take this anymore, right? And then the wife says, let's say this is the husband who was silent and silent and silent, or the wife who was silent and silent and silent, and then suddenly, explodes, and the other spouse is going, what on earth happened to you? She was always bothered from the beginning, but never said anything. The differences were so stark and they could not figure this communication issue between them out from the very beginning. So then it seemed like there was this very huge gap between them, but it was always there. Right? But then children came, and in-laws and family and so on, and it sort of confused the situation, and nothing was ever really sorted out between them. But you see, again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does things with immense hikmah, right? Where there is the time naturally built in to make sure beforehand, right? And this is one of the main points of what the wadi is supposed to do, to check the person out and make sure this is going to synchronize well, right, in the marriage. And also then the time period of when they're first married, this is before marriage, is when you should have a premarital counseling and figure out but so many times this doesn't even happen. Yeah, good job, good status, good family, on you. And there isn't even a discussion of whether this is going to be the best of foods. Then, let's say it is. Let's say we got past that stage. Then there should be this communication between them. But there's all this, there's a lot of shyness and a lot of inhibitions, and it should be there. All the modesty should be there, but there should still be this communication process ahead of time to figure out. Sometimes we have couples that come who literally the first thing they say to us is, Alhamdulillah, everything's great. They're on cloud 9. They're on cloud 9. It's paradise up here. Mashallah, we're fine, everything's great. There's no problems between us. The therapist starts talking, and all of a sudden, things they couldn't even think they had a problem with, they realize, oh, subhanAllah, we need to take a minute to figure this out, right? And mashallah, thankfully they've done that before they're living under one roof, because it could very much explode later, right? So premarital. And by the way, this is very much part of our tradition as well, and I could speak about that for a very, very long time, but since that's not exactly the topic today, we'll save that for another day. then even within that is getting help when help is needed. And so much in our community, there is this, we'll just deal with it amongst ourselves, amongst our family, amongst ourselves. And it doesn't quite work that way. There is a loss, there's losing sight of what the whole purpose of spirituality was in the family, and the whole purpose of what marriage was in the family in the first place. Hence my earlier discussion of the murabbi, right? My earlier discussion of the teachers, the earlier discussion of even the counselors, the people who can act, who come from a place of knowledge and can actually help direct this properly. Okay? I think we spent a good deal of time on that, and let's shift a little bit of the discussion furthermore, and say that really having this, having an understanding that marriage is a door, your spouse is a door to either heaven or hell. This is a very important point, and I feel a lot of people don't understand this concept. And either this spouse is going to take you by the hand into Jannah or into Jahannam. It has everything to do with the choice that you make ahead of time, but let's say now you're married, and maybe you've been married. Now you have to look at it with the eyes of this person is either going to pull me down or bring me up, and which is it going to be? And inshallah we work on bringing each other up, right? Pulling each other up is the goal here, right? To pull each other into Jannah and your children along with you. This is, if you have this outlook in life, then it affects everything into your interactions with each other at home. And the interactions between the two of you, your interactions with your children, and your interactions with the family, your extended family, and the community beyond. If you have this proper understanding of what the point is of you on earth, and what the point is of children on earth, and what the point is of having a home together, right? Again, the topic was on spirituality within the home, so we're laying the framework and the foundation. Now, there's so much more that we can talk about, and like I said, if we can go into the series of kind of from marriage to preconception and what the point of having children is, and how a mother, when she finds out that she is now expecting, she's pregnant, how to actually spiritually ready herself and psychologically ready herself for this growing fetus in her body that is going to now become a baby, and what that means in those stages, in those months of pregnancy. So much is a pregnancy, I find women doing, of complaining of the nausea, and complaining of the morning sickness, and I hear you, it is tough. I speak as a mother of children. Okay? Alhamdulillah, I get it. Been there, done that as well. It is difficult. However, there is also a very important spiritual part of marriage. And a lot of that is the psychological effect of what is growing here. And my teachers of spirituality have shared so many stories. Amazing stories. I could probably spend the whole next hour maybe talking about the stories of pregnant women and their connection with their baby that starts when the baby's actually in gestation, right? SubhanAllah. And the women who read Quran and then their children come out later to be comforted by the sound of Quran because they heard that in the womb. Right? Nowadays they have these machines that babies are arresting things of white noise and jungle noise and I don't know what noise. And it's like, what happened to the Quran? Had they heard the recitation of Quran in the womb, they would be comforted by it when they're outside of the womb. Again, I could quote all kinds of even medical studies that talk about the connection between the two and at what point the baby, which is very early on, actually starts to hear. It is very early in gestation, right? And continues onward to the end. SubhanAllah. All of these things in kind of getting ready with pregnancy. And also, if we talk about that, we can spend a whole time talking about the delivery process itself and how that is a time of connectedness and spirituality with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as soon as the baby is born, and all of a sudden rituals that go with that. True? There is a reason and a hikmah why the very first sound the baby hears is the what? Yes. Right? The name of Allah. There is a reason for such things. Yeah, and the very first thing the baby tastes is what? Yeah, the tanqiyah, exactly. Right? All of these things are so important. There's a hikmah and understanding of connecting again with spirituality and connecting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from literally the moments of conception and even before, as we mentioned. Right? Now this child is going to be born and is going to go, let's say, from age 0, first week, right? And then we break it down into stages of spirituality all the way through until they become adults. So I'll close with one case example of what I mean by this, because like I said, this is a much, much bigger discussion than we have time for today. And Sheikh Rami is going to continue the discussion a little bit further. But let's give one practical example of what I'm talking about. Let's use prayer as an example of this. You know and I know that the hadith says what about prayer? Teach your children prayer. What? What does it say? Now? Perfect. So the sister said that the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ says, teach your children to pray by 7. And what? What comes after? We'll use the word, to discipline them by 10. Okay? 7 and 10. How many of you have kids who are just about 7? How many of you have kids just about 10? How many have kids that are older than 10? Oh, a lot. MashaAllah. How many of your kids pray regularly? MashaAllah. That's a lot of love. Alright, so this is why we use this as an example. Because the hadith is here. And the hadith is clear. I mean, it could be even more clear than this. And the scholars then take from this hadith and explain things about Sawm, and explain other forms of ibadah based on this hadith as well. But let's just use prayer, since it's exactly the wording of the hadith. How are you going to teach your child to pray by 7 if they don't know the basics of prayer itself? Or the prerequisites to prayer, which are what? Wudu, tahara. Okay, so we're mentioning fiqh-based things. How many of you have thought to sign up your 7-year-old for fiqh classes? 1. Allah. 2. Are there fiqh classes for children in your community? Allahu Akbar. Now, since there is, and the sister says very loudly in the back, yes. Since there are, why are there only 2 kids there? I don't know your community and I don't know what's happening. I'm an outsider. I'm an outsider kind of coming in. Mashallah, I don't mean to instigate any trouble. But what I need to say is it's a very practical and important thing. We just spent this whole last 40-some minutes talking about, I think it's been that long, talking about what? Spirituality in the home, and children in the home, and the point of being on earth, and the point of parents, and the point of children. And yet you have such a clear hadith of teach your children to pray by 7. How on earth are your children going to pray if they don't know the different parts of prayer? And how are they going to stand in prayer if they haven't figured out how to do wudu? And how are you going to teach wudu if you haven't spoken about tahara? What is najis, impure, and what is pure? For children. Now you don't need to give them a huge advanced book of fiqh and say, here, that doesn't work with children. But you need to have somebody who's dynamic and able to engage with them and explain to them the basics of what they need to know. True? Now, that's 7. How young is 7? What grade is 7? Yes, about 2nd grade. 8, 9, 7, 8, and 9. That the children, little by little, are brought into the understanding and the beginnings of prayer. Because the simple part is actually teaching them how to make wudu and pray. That's the simple part. The more difficult part is getting them to do what? To do this regularly. And every child, subhanAllah, every child is different. Some children like this. Okay, mom, ready to pray? Let's go. For that you go, alhamdulillah, like you should be saying a little bit of alhamdulillah all day long. All day long. But many children, what's going on with them? Come on, prayer time, come on, prayer time. I mean, it is sometimes, and for some children, it really feels like you're pulling teeth. And then there's the question of, am I causing them to hate the prayer, right? I mean, these are very real questions, yeah? This is why I really think in everything that the mother and father do, assuming they're actually doing this in the first place, you need to have the murabbi or the mentor who's re-emphasizing what you're trying to emphasize, but separate from you, and is doing so in a cool and hip manner. I'm very serious about this, right? I work a lot with youth and I've been running youth groups for over a decade now, working with young people, right? You need those mentors, you need these young people to really be excited and excite the children about such essentially routine actions like prayer. Now, some of your children do very well if you reward them. Keep a point system, you give them rewards of some sort of gifts they need at the end or life at the end. And other times, some of your children, reward doesn't work and it's more punishment, although I really, really suggest, personal suggestion, That punishment isn't implemented until the hadith, like the hadith says what? Yeah, by 10, and that's clear, that there is a consequence for not praying. How old, what grade is a 10-year-old in? Yeah, about 5th grade roughly. 5th grade. Now take a moment, and don't say out loud, when you started to pray. For those who pray regularly. For those who pray regularly. All right. We have somebody who's willing to say, because it was early, Allahu Akbar, 6th grade. Most people are staying silent because they know that they were not in 6th grade when they first started praying regularly. Because again, the hadith, as much and as genuine as your parents and wonderful as they probably were, this was not a central part, potentially, of raising you. But we hope that you'll have a different experience, and your children, especially in this country, will have a different experience. Because to have children in this country who are going to stop, drop, and pray 5 times a day, it's going to be almost miraculous. And really, it's not going to happen unless you put that effort in. And so what do the teachers say? They say this is the hadith. So my teacher, for example, the one who wrote the manual on raising a spiritual child, she gives recommendations at every single stage of what to do with prayer. So she talks about the 2 and 3 and 4-year-olds, and how when they get really curious and they're kind of looking at you, and they start, the little kids and start doing the actions of prayer, but they don't really know what you're doing, and they get to the very bottom of the ruku and then sujood, and they start doing cartwheels, or they start doing somersaults. She says, let them be, bring them into the prayer space. This concept of children should be seen but not heard is not okay in our deen. They have to be part and parcel of the prayer space and process, even if they're doing somersaults, right? That they love being there with the family, and there should be jama'ah, congregational prayer between the husband and wife, okay? And there should be, and whoever, by the way, whoever's in the household, there should be prayer together, and the children should see this. And then when they get a little bit older and can stand, even if they don't know the correct wording, they're just excited to put down their little kid's prayer rug, and you should invest in looking for a little kid's prayer rug, or perhaps make one, or make them together out of felt or from the craft store together, right? And their little kufi if they're a boy, or a little prayer outfit if they're a girl, and they have their prayer items, and they're so excited about them, and you put nice smell, also very nice smell in them, and there's an excitement, because why? Because children start to connect things. You pray together, and afterwards, even though they don't know all this parts, this is all before 7. Yeah, we're talking about 4, 5, 6-year-olds. Yeah, they don't know all the parts of prayer, but what they do know is that every time they stand next to you and they pray, that as soon as you finish your salams, the first thing you do is hug them. I'm so proud of you. I'm so happy. I'm so excited. They see this joy and excitement of the parents, and they connect in their minds prayer with something good, something exciting, something I want to do consistently. Because a lot of the times what children want from you as parents is your attention. And our attention, and I'm absolutely included in this, is divided in all kinds of other distractions. They want our attention. And so when they get positive attention, and they, in their little brains, start connecting that to prayer, imagine what prayer starts to mean to them. So we're not talking, parents always ask me, I have a 14-year-old, and he drives me crazy because he won't get up for salah. It's like, well, what were you doing with him when he was 4? Silence. Do you see what I'm saying? The story starts early on, very, very early on. Because how that 14-year-old when he was 4 and 5 and 6 connected to positive, and I mean, I'll do this just for disclosure here, sitting with my own parents, and my own children rather, and the hug afterwards, even the dhikr, even the tasbih that you do after prayer, the 33s, yeah? Even that, I'll say, instead of holding a masbaha, subha, the prayer beads, I'll actually say, hey, give me your hand. And I'll actually do it on her or his hand. So they feel the closeness and connection. And they're excited. They're like, they put out their hand like, Mama, do dhikr on my hand. Do dhikr on my hand. And they feel that connection, right? Prayer becomes an exciting thing. Why? Because eventually they're going to reach the age that they have to now start learning the proper fiqh of it. The 7, the 8, and the 9. And here's where you have your chance to slowly but surely start to go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 prayers. By 10? And I'm like, I have to tell you, I'm like sweating telling you this because I have one that's about to turn 10. Just sweating beads here. MashaAllah, realizing the importance and the gravity of what it means that when she is 10 has to pray all 5 prayers. Do you see what I'm saying? But to know that as much as it's as hard of a routine to build in, I know from my own childhood, and this, by the way, I thank my father for this, because although I was a girl, and although I had brothers, I always was brought to the prayer with him. He'd say, Rania, let's go pray Jannah. Let's go pray. Let's go. Always, side by side with him. Always. And I can tell you through the psyche of, for me as a girl, as a little kid, what that did to me. Because it was my exciting time to be with my father. Do you see what I'm saying? And although he was a very busy person doing a lot of important things out there and didn't have a ton of time, the time that was there was a quality time. Do you see what I'm saying? People complain all the time about their spouse being busy and so on. But the time that is there is quality and is spiritual in nature. And I know Allah Ta'ala Adam, but there's a direct correlation between that as a child and later being excited to study the ilm and go forward. Right? So I recommend that this happen. And then I have mothers who say, but my husband doesn't pray or doesn't pray regularly. Mothers, you should know, parents in general, men and women here, because sometimes I get the opposite complaint too. The husband prays but the wife doesn't. Say, look, for children, it takes at least one. Preferably two, granted, preferably two. But even one. I can't tell you the number of people who have said, I only have one person who prays. Maybe it's a mother, maybe it was a father, maybe it was a grandparent. But because of that one person, they came out praying regularly. Do you see? And it was something they're fond of, they're excited about, they're happy with. Look, for anybody, routine is hard. 5 times a day is a routine. And it takes a lot of pre-planning. And a lot of effort. We know that. Look, I'll give you a very small and almost excuse the example. But here in a masjid, to go make wudu, it's set up for you to make wudu. To go and use the restroom, afwan, it's set up for you to do so. But you go outside to the shopping mall, or to your soccer game, your kid's soccer game, and now it's prayer time, what will you do? You literally have to pre-plan. In your purse, I sure hope all of you are carrying your little lota around, afwan. Right? Because American bathrooms don't have such things for cleansing yourself. True? And then there's the issue of making wudu in public, which I sure hope everybody's gotten comfortable enough to put their foot in the sink by this point in time. Yes? And make proper wudu. And then to have the comfort of praying in public. Which, whether if it's in the mall, that's easy, because you find a store that has a fitting room and you pray. But if not, then you find any quieter corner and you pray there. Or if you're in a soccer field, you find a corner there and you pray on the grass. Allah has made the earth a masjid for the Muslim. Do you see what I'm saying? It takes pre-planning, though, to remember your 5 daily prayers. And when your children do see you do that, then they will do so too. But don't say later, why does my child not pray? And yet they'll be out with you shopping, grocery shopping, or regular shopping at the mall, and they'll see Buhur come in and out, Asr come in and out, Maghrib come in and out, and you've done nothing. And then you're going to wonder why they're not praying. Allahu Akbar, right? So here's what we say, like this takes effort. It takes real heart, it takes real pre-planning, it takes understanding what the point of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala having put us on earth has been. So that when they reach the age of 10, and now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says discipline. I know the word in Arabic is what? Yes, darab, right? To hit, and often translated as such. Some children, that works. Some children, it doesn't matter what you do, that doesn't work. So what does work? And why I've heard my teachers often saying, forgive those who may agree with this translation, but have said to discipline. Because for some, taking away all their Legos or a portion of them, like in our family, works. For others, taking away some sort of privilege. They'll feel the pinch because they can't go over and spend the night at their cousins, or they can't have their cousin over, or whatever the case may be, or they can't go to such and such place, or they can't go to soccer practice. Ouch. But this did nothing to them. Do you see what I'm saying? So there's a consequence for having left that prayer by them. And then if we go further and continue down the line, if that's happening and you're serious about that from when they're little kids all the way through 10, as they go into their tweens, right? 12, 13, 14, right onto their teen years, now we're talking just about a matter of habit. And one of the main things, and I will close with this, forgive me, Sheikh Rami, I've gone a little further, but one of the main things that I'll close with here is that people often complain about teens. And our teachers of spirituality explain to us that teenagers, this concept in this age called teenagers, is a Western construct that did not exist in Islamic societies. You went from Before puberty, you are a child, and after you're considered an adult. Now, granted, you're not ready to maybe, balance a checkbook and all the rest, perhaps. But in terms of on the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you, meaning our teens, meaning puberty time, right? In the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they are ready to take on the same spiritual responsibilities as adults, of prayer and of fasting. Subhanallah, right? So what does that mean? That means that falling into this idea that, they're teenagers, therefore they are supposed to rebel, they're supposed to yell, they're supposed to slam doors, they're supposed to be disrespectful, garbage. It has no essence in our deen. Granted, there might be a little bit of trying to figure out their identity, but you know what the teachers of spirituality say about this stage? They say this is the peak of spirituality. Allahu Akbar. That mid-teens into about the mid-20s, that is, they call it the peak of spirituality. Why? Because this is the stage before responsibilities. Often, children aren't going to be married at 15 and 16, at least not in this society right now. They don't have the responsibility of caring, most of the time, of caring for others. That's coming still, right? They don't have yet a spouse, they don't have children, they don't have elderly parents, perhaps, that they have to now take care of. They're in a different stage of life, and they're not children anymore. They are actually wiser and a little more responsible and can understand more. So when they're in this middle stage, and now they have both time and intellect. What do teenagers usually fill their time with? Tell me, what do they usually fill their time with? Social media, what else?
Video games.
TV, yes, what else? Drama, okay, alright. Music, yes. Actors, musicians, so on, pop star, whatever, these people that are now their role models and so on, right? Defining themselves. But if you define yourself with these aspects and you thing is you have time and intellect. And I just explained the teachers of spirituality say this is the peak of spirituality. This is the stage of life. Then if you get it right, you have the time to have what they call the taste of Iman. To really experience the connection between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you're saying to me, what, at 15 and 16-year-old, are you serious? Wallahi, I'm speaking from personal experience. And I'm speaking from experience of the young people like myself who had studied early on, alhamdulillah, tabarakallah. And I'll tell you something, that this is the stage, because you don't have the responsibilities of children waking up in the middle of the night crying and you have to go deal with them and work the next day and such and other thing, you can get up for tahajjud without any problem. You can get up and call to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You can get up and pray and beseech Him. You can get up and do as many of God as you wish and as much Quran as you wish and as much learning and hop from masjid to masjid and place to place to learn and masajid and so on and speakers and scholars and the rest. Either you will fill that void or that part of your life, the peak of spirituality, with a connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and literally live off of it for the rest of your life going forward and always think back to those days. Or you will fill that void with boys, with singers, with actors, with drama, with rubbish, teenage rubbish. Amounts to nothing, means nothing, and it will do nothing for you except for potential heartache in the future. So the heart, and forgive the words here, I know we have some younger people in the audience, so I'm careful of the words I'm choosing, but either you're going to lean towards spirituality or you're going to lean to what this society promotes intensely. Somebody said it in the audience, yes. And I won't say it because we have young people in the room, but I'll use a similar word, promiscuity. Right? Either you're going to lean this way or you're going to lean that way, and that's what that spirituality is going to be filled with. Does that make sense? So now we really start to understand what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted from us on earth, what the point when He says He's only created us except to worship Him at every stage of life. And this now is the foundation for interacting together, right? For when you interact with your family members, when the spouses interact together, and when you interact with your children. This is the foundation, which I hope, inshallah, we laid that foundation for now, Sheikh Rami, to take from here and pick up from here on some more practical discussion on this. So we'll just let you know we're taking a 5-minute stretch break. We'll just stand up and stretch, inshallah ta'ala, and sit right back down to listen to him. والحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.